Good morning. My name is James Crabtree. Welcome to the latest event in GovInsider Live's Festival of Innovation, which has been running all of this week from here in Singapore, where I join you this morning. Today, we're going to be talking about sustainability matters, how the COVID pandemic has affected moves towards a more sustainable world, how the recovery can be made greener, and what are the best examples that we can look to for inspiration and innovation on climate change and sustainability as the recovery from COVID continues. So this morning I'm joined by a fantastic panel who, in the order in which they will be speaking, so we begin from the top level, joining us from the United States this evening, her time, Kanni Wignaraja, who is the Assistant Secretary General and Director of the Regional Bureau for Asia and the Pacific from the UNDP. So she will be speaking first. Secondly, to get a sense from the ground here in Asia, we're joined by Emil Dardak, who's the Vice Governor of East Java in Indonesia. And then finally, from here in Singapore, we're joined by Sorkin, who is the Director of the Global Resilient Cities Network, which is the successor organization to 100 Resilient Cities, which many of you will be familiar with. So the way we're going to run this session is each of our speakers is going to speak for about 10 minutes. Kanni and Lauren are going to speak without slides. Emil has a short presentation which he's going to make, but they'll speak in that order. Then we will have a discussion amongst ourselves, but we'll also be able to take questions from the audience. So I know that this morning that this broadcast is going out on a number of different social media platforms, particularly Facebook and YouTube. So if you're watching on those platforms, feel free to leave a question in the comments, and our moderators will look for questions. So identify who you are, give your name and your designation, and if you want to which of the speakers you want to ask a question, and then we'll pick the best of those at the end and put those to the audience. So please do feel free to ask questions as we go along. Very good. And we'll wrap up absolutely on time at 10 o'clock Singapore time or 10 p.m. Connecticut time, where Kanni is. So thank you very much for joining us this morning. And let me turn to each of my speakers one after the other. So Kanni, can I turn to you and ask you to begin our discussion this morning on sustainability matters and the post-COVID sustainable recovery?
Thank you, James. And thank you to GovInsider hosts for putting up this Festival of Innovation. It's great to join everyone and be here with you. Now, I do not have to state our collective concern and confusion about the times we're living in today. Development progress is so fast being undone, and at a faster rate than we were actually able to put it together. And now it will take us much longer to get back on track with the SDGs. And this is of deep concern to UNDP and to the UN as a whole. So as a global community, we really need to now take unprecedented measures to stop this confluence of factors destroying all that we have built and all we want to do for a global future. So I wanted to share with all of you maybe 3 key points where I feel that innovation can really help us get back on track on the sustainability agenda, and maybe even help to accelerate some of the benefits in terms of our own health and the health of our planet. So first, directly tackling this coronavirus. Now, while we knew close to nothing about this virus 8 to 9 months ago, we now have a clear idea what it is, how it strikes, and possibly even what needs to be done. And scientific knowledge and breakthroughs will underpin our global and national health responses and expand it at a speed and scale that we have not seen before. Now, this is much needed as a health response that has to go beyond current levels of testing and contact tracing and treatment to actually reach much, much larger numbers. And we hear it repeatedly said that no one is safe until everyone is safe. But what does this really mean in terms of planning and investments in health infrastructure to cover not just a last mile, but many, many miles? So our UN maxim of leaving no one behind, I think, will be severely tested by the global health effort to get out the vaccine. To ensure a fast and fair distribution of a COVID vaccine as soon as it becomes available will mean managing a highly efficient and robust cold chain, for example. Now, the government of India and UNDP's award-winning program, the EVEN program, which stands for Electronic Vaccination Intelligence Network, we've tested this so it enables healthcare workers to effectively manage vaccine logistics and actually have real-time information on the availability of vaccine stocks and if they're being stored properly. Now, it comes to you as a smartphone app, which helps to manage these stocks. And these are now available and actually being used with other vaccines in over 27,000 centers across India. So this is a kind of blend of medical and digital expertise for fast-acting solutions that will really be essential if we're to swiftly reach the 4.3 billion people that we are in Asia and the Pacific. Now, Singapore, where you are, has shown us an example of successful citizen tech innovation, which you would be very familiar with, when a group of citizens volunteers and joins up with government to design and utilize Trace Together, the popular community tracing app, and others have tried to emulate that. Singapore is known as one of the leading innovator countries in the world and is very high on the list of the Global Innovation Index. And now we see the Republic of Korea has just joined them in the top 10 countries in the world. But there's also other kinds of innovation that drive sustainability, and that is about doing the right thing early on, which does not always have to be tech-driven or too exciting, but it is the early mover boldness that counts. And this is the story of universal healthcare. And we have seen how it has helped a country like Thailand, for example, much better, where it is in a much better state than many other countries in the region. And this was the weapon which they had already deployed decades ago. Now, a second point, so that's a first kind of bundle, if you wish, of issues. And the second one is state-citizen trust, which is, to me, at a premium during a time of emergence. Now, real-time public communication to provide people with warnings of outbreaks, announcing lockdowns, providing factual prevention and care information, and just staying in regular touch to calm a society's fears. This has been managed very differently in countries in our region. And depending on the veracity of information provided and government's outreach, people's trust in their leaders have either grown or waned. And you can see in countries like Vietnam and New Zealand, the positive power of such public communications and how it has built that kind of trust. Now, beyond the leaders and their relationship with people, mobile and internet access has also been key to making this work. So affordable internet access has allowed people to continue not just with the receiving information, but to get their education, to continue with work, and to stay connected with each other. So if I look at our Access to Information partnership with the government of Bangladesh, which operates about 5,000 digital centers across the country, it provides a connection to all those who need access to public services. Yet, this again is not enough. So we are moving and pushing to ask for affordable internet connectivity that should be provided as a universal public good and made available to all people. Now, in our region, the rates of internet penetration vary quite dramatically, from over, let's say, 90% in the Republic of Korea to around 30% in Timor-Leste. So UNDP is working very closely, particularly with small landlocked and island states, to ensure this greater connectivity. Now, as governments mobilize billions, even trillions of dollars around the world to recover from the pandemic, we can see that those with existing or fast-growing investments in mobile and internet connectivity, moving into 5G, into optic fiber, all those are transitioning much faster into the digital economy. Now, the direction of travel towards this fourth industrial revolution has been inevitable for some time, but I think COVID-19 has been an accelerant. And we're seeing the work of robotics, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, the Internet of Things, genetic engineering, and other technology-driven ways of working are absolutely going to be part of that next normal. And recent research coming out of MIT and others indicates that about 12% of current jobs across Asian markets could be automated over the next 5 years, with AI affecting at least 1 in 5 jobs. At the same time, we know that approximately 70% of Asia's labor force, and I'm sure this is the case as well in countries like Indonesia, is currently dependent on the informal sector. So in order to square this circle, many, many more people will need to get digital learning and skills, and then that affordable access to these technologies and to the internet to actually benefit from the Industrial Revolution will be key, because if not, we'll only be diminished or even destroyed by it. In fact, in the Philippines, we're exploring some new data-powered anticipatory governance models to deal with COVID-19 implications for food security in the country. So the future of work and the future of food production will be very, very interconnected. So James, this brings me to my third and final point, because a vaccine that needs a cold chain also needs a sustainable energy source to power it across all terrains. And the future of work, or the future of food and health that benefits the largest numbers of people are going to be really that keeps both people and planet healthy, is something that will need green energy. Now, according to the Paris Climate Agreement, if we are to remain within the limits of that 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise, we need to achieve a 7.6% reduction in CO2 emissions each year for the coming decade. Even with the shutdown of the global economy and the widespread big city lockdowns in 2020, it only resulted in a 5.6% reduction. So just doing the math, this will take a radical transformation of how we produce, how we travel, and how we power up our grids. Now, the social and economic case for renewables is clear. Recent auctions and power purchase agreements indicate that solar energy is now about 20% cheaper than coal on average. Investments in renewable energy is generating 3 times more jobs than investments in polluting fossil fuels. So we are seeing countries pivot, but it's going to take a while. We're just hoping that they're going to do it at a faster pace. And UNDP is supporting governments to bring renewable energy access to some of the most disadvantaged communities in countries as divergent as Indonesia and Vanuatu. And we're urging private sector to invest in renewables as a win-win, because now the economic case is made. And like access to the internet, these efforts have to move rapidly to scale. And that needs public policy coming together with private sector investments. So in closing, let me say that the term scale is often overused. What works for one household or a community or a country need not be optimal for another. However, when it comes to digital connectivity and renewable energy, just like with a COVID vaccine, what is good for one is actually good for all 4.3 billion of us in the Asia and the Pacific. Thank you, and back to you, James.
Thank you very much, Kanni. That was a great introduction. You managed to cover a lot of ground in your 10 minutes. I'm very grateful for you for putting those 3 points on the table. Let me now go over to Java in Indonesia and hand the floor over to Vice Governor Emil Dardak to give us a sense of how things look on the ground in one of our neighbor countries. So, Emil, over to you.
Okay. Thank you. A very good morning to all the participants of this Gov Insider Live, and to the moderator, and to Assistant Secretary General and Director of the Asia Pacific UNDP, and also from Global Resilient Cities Network and moderator, James Crabtree. It's a pleasure to be joining this forum. I'll try to also look more into the context of COVID-19 and how it affects the local economy in East Java. Just to put a bit of context first, East Java is the second largest province in terms of population in Indonesia. We have 40 million people spread over 38 municipalities. And in terms of economic size or our regional GDP, we are also the second largest after Jakarta. In terms of population, we are the second largest after West Java. So despite the fact that we're not the largest province in terms of population, but we are still the best after Jakarta in terms of the economic size. Now, that gives an idea on the scale of impact and scale of activities that we have to manage in times of this pandemic. So if I can share with you a couple of slides. The first one is a very simple explanation that this COVID-19 creates both supply and demand shock. So factories can't operate, shops cannot open, transportation has to be limited, and this affects the productivity, but at the same time also household that loses their occupation, households that no longer can attain income, result in lower demand. So both supply and demand were contracted, and we saw that the massive decline took place in the second quarter of 2020. Our economy in 2020 went into contraction in the second quarter. In the first quarter, we grew usually by 5% and above, and it went down to approximately 3%. And in the last quarter, it went down to 5.9%, although it was still the least contracted economy in the island of Java. Next. So if we look into what we're trying to do, I think none of us believe that we can or think that we can eliminate the pandemic unless we discover the vaccine, as was very comprehensively explained by the previous speaker from UNDP. But we're trying to flatten the curve. We want to avoid a situation where patients went, untreatable because of the lack of medical facilities. So we did we pursued two methods. The first being trying to increase and scale up the medical facilities, but at the same time, we tried to reduce the level of mobility and economic intensity in order to flatten the curve. Now, this process of flattening the curve extends the lifetime of the virus, of the pandemic, and also create a negative impact to the economy. But we have to do that because I think we need to make sure that we don't have unmanageable number of cases in East Java. Now, on the right-hand side bottom is basically a diagram showing which sectors actually lost and which sectors actually won in terms of the pandemic impact. And products such as pharmaceuticals, food and beverage, electronics, telecommunication, logistic services, and even to a certain extent, textile manufacturing that were able to refocus their production into producing masks and hazardous material suits. They were able to survive and even triumph during this moment. But those that relied on tourism, on mining, construction, some financial services, even automotive sector, they actually suffered the most during the crisis. Next. So what did we try to do? First of all, in terms of economic impact, what is very important is to make sure that nobody, that we were mindful of the fact that more people are below the poverty line because they lost their income, their livelihood. Now, we need to introduce social safety net. Now, in Indonesia, the value-added tax and income tax all go to the central government and comes back to local government or subnational governments by means of transfer funding. Now, local governments can collect certain taxes. For example, in the provincial government, we collect taxes on automobile licenses and also purchases of new cars. And municipalities, such as cities and other local governments, they collect taxes from land and also from revenues of entertainment or restaurant establishments. Now, these are car sales as well as entertainment establishments, and property taxes are ones that suffer the most. But at the same time, we did not have the liberty to pursue deficit financing like what the central government does. But we try to make sure that we can actually still reallocate our budget accordingly to save those who are in dire financial situation. Now, we introduced what we call the provincial social safety net, and we designed that to be in complementary with what the central government has designed. So central government has embarked on roughly 6 to 6.5 million families intervention, providing them with cash support over the course of initially 3 months. Now, we discovered that when provincial funding is coming in, we need to make sure, 6.5 out of 13 million families are being supported by the central government. I have to revise my number, 6 million families. Now, in that situation, we realized that there were families that weren't accessed by these financing as well, and we need to come in. So the easiest way politically for a political leader is to simply just distribute the funding pro rata based on the population, or just spread it evenly. But we discovered that some municipalities suffer more than others because the economic structure varies. Some municipalities rely more on agriculture and on primary sectors, and while others rely on industries, manufacturing, and trade. Now, the intervention from central government in terms of social safety net actually inclined more or skewed more towards the rural area, where rural area actually benefits from the fact that their production activities in agriculture can still continue and they have lower cost of living. While in the urban areas, most of the activities got shut down and they also have higher living expenses. So what we did is we designed 2 programs. The first is social safety net that provides supplementary support on top of what the central government is providing, strictly for those who are living in urban areas. We provide 50% of what the central government is providing. And for the other areas, we provide social safety net that are allocated using quota. And these quota are calculated based on how many percent of the population have been covered by central government support, and how many percent of the population relies on sectors that are hit the most, which are tourism, restaurants, and also trade and services, and some manufacturing. So that's what we did for the first 3 months. But now, if we go, I will explain a bit more, but we try to focus more on reigniting the economy. Although we are mindful that we are still facing problems in the spread of the pandemic. We haven't really concluded our first wave. We're still on the rise, but the daily numbers have not risen. So we've been hovering around. So while previously we have a probably not so exponential, but rising daily cases, But now the daily cases are hovers around 300, sometimes less, and sometimes 400. But it's on that cruising altitude, if I can say. It hasn't gone down, and we try to make sure that we put in enough efforts to keep it that way, and put it decline, so we don't loosen up or relax it a bit. Okay, so finally, to wrap up, I'd like to also mention that next, if we go next, okay, to the last slide. Let's go to the last slide. I'll try to answer more on the details in. Okay, sorry, just go to the previous slide. So we can see that in the third quarter, a lot of the activities are returning to nearly the pre-pandemic level in quarter one. And we are very mindful that this is also we need to be cautious about this. So what we do is central government is pushing in a lot of funding in the forms of cash support and even expanding liquidity of banks. We also have provincial government banks which has taken in roughly $200 million, and we put in some of our budget to put a revolving fund to be funding activities and trying to reignite the supply side economics. And carefully managing the reopening of activities is important to put a bit of room for demand, but also not to make sure that we don't have cases going beyond our capability or uncontrollable. With that, I conclude the presentation to start with. Thank you much.
Thank you very much, Emil. Again, many thanks for giving us that overview. It's interesting to hear how progress is being made at the local level, and we can come back to some of the other things that you're trying to do and how you see the outlook in Indonesia. Let me now turn over to Lauren from the Resilient Cities Network to give us a sense of how the battle for urban resilience in the face of climate change has been affected by the pandemic and the look forward from there. So Lauren, over to you.
Thanks so much, James. Thanks for having me this morning. For those of you who aren't as familiar with our work, the Global Resilient Cities Network is a city-led network, and we are the world's leading urban resilience network, representing 97 cities in over 40 countries and 220 million citizens. We are based here in Singapore. 20 of our city members are here in Asia Pacific. And we are the only global network of cities to be based out of Southeast Asia. And we're very proud to be here. As I begin, I want to say for those that are listening, thank you for tuning in. There are a lot of these kinds of presentations, and I really hope that the information and knowledge that we're providing today is going to be useful to you as you're responding to this obviously unprecedented time. I want to also share, as I begin, two perhaps less obvious facts. One is I am a millennial and I am an optimist. And I say those two things because I am part of a generation, along with Generation Z that comes behind us, that's grown up with technology enabling our lives. And we're also a generation who will have to lead as we confront more and more of these compounding crises. And the only way that we can do that is by leveraging our networks. Now, Governor Emil highlighted how municipalities are suffering, and their needs can differ depending on their challenges. And in fact, even between a rural and an urban area, there can be distinct differences. Yet he also highlighted the need to design for something that we've also been talking about in Global Resilient Cities Network, which is to respond to the COVID-19 crisis really in three phases. We have to look at what we're doing in terms of response. Then we have to look at recovery. And while we're doing that, in parallel, we have to plan for a new normal. We've learned over 6 years of working together with our network that cities are much more alike than they are different. And it is because of these commonalities that they can share knowledge and they can really do work at the speed that is required despite constraints in capacity. Now, Kanni offered some excellent insights as well. And one of those was that systems have been dismantled at an alarming rate, and it will take us a long time to rebuild them. And while I agree with that, I also want to offer that optimist's view that, in fact, many of our systems were quite broken, and we do have this opportunity, perhaps once in a lifetime opportunity, to build back more equitable, safe, and climate-ready cities if we are using common frameworks like urban resilience. and if we work with our cities on the front lines to channel solutions. So COVID-19 has made it absolutely impossible to ignore the trends that we've already seen. We are facing these unprecedented challenges that combine climate change, pollution, inequality, pandemics, and they're all global now. Cities are uniquely poised to confront these crises, but they need a new way to organize for and confront our biggest problems. So in that vein, urban resilience is really key. When a city looks at all its needs and actions as connected, they can strengthen the fabric of the city with every action, from building a road to organizing COVID assistance to build back better and better prepared for the future. So we partner with cities and help them develop these powerful solutions and projects that have a bigger impact and address multiple needs and benefit the most vulnerable. So this work requires tremendous innovation on the part of cities. They have to rethink who a city is and adapt how they view the connection and interdependency of their different communities and functions. I want to give an example of this kind of work where you can take a systemic approach and build back better than where you started. So Quito in Ecuador, they have taken an approach to food security that is a very compelling example. Quito is geographically isolated. One bad seismic event could cut off food to the city. This is probably a shock that many in this region, whether in New Zealand or in Indonesia, can relate to. The resilience team in Quito did a very careful analysis of their food system. And the resilience team there saw that they could address multiple needs via food: better health, income generating activities, and reducing food insecurity. They spent months working to make this a city government priority, with learning sessions from across our network with New York, with Paris, and with New Orleans. And eventually they succeeded in making this one of the central mechanisms of their resilience strategy. And the city government has oriented its plans around the food system. They encourage small-scale urban farms, including 200 new farms in the past year, training these farmers about organic practices and how to farm smarter. And they collaborated with local food industry players to foster a network of farmers markets to speed distribution and to increase access in food swamps. So when COVID-19 hit, they already had the mechanisms in place to provide healthy food to the neediest. And they fed over 400 families a week. In many neighborhoods, urban farms were directly supplying to their neighborhoods. So they didn't have to take long, risky trips to faraway markets. Now, we take this back to our network and focus a step further by centering cities in our leadership to increase the potential for collective action. So Resilient Cities Network is governed by cities, and we empower them to deploy these solutions and scale lessons for impact. We've spent the past year listening to our network of over 97 cities tell us what they need. And we reviewed 4,000 different resilience projects to look at the areas of greatest demand from cities for solutions. So we could figure out, what was that heat map? What were the solution areas? What were the technologies that were necessary so we could replicate them in multiple cities? And partners, private sector, civil society, play a very critical role in the scaling effect. And I want to talk to another example that really comes to the compounding crisis around climate, around sustainability in our cities and neighborhoods. So Rotterdam in the Netherlands, which some of you may be familiar with, major port city, has a huge flooding problem. They have built multiple water squares over the past decades in previously gray neighborhoods. In a series of 3 basins, they created capture areas so that in times of flooding, they could fill with water and prevent generalized flooding around the city. And so when it's dry, they can also use these places as a raised theater area, as skate parks for sports, and having a whole area that's landscaped for community development. And now, during COVID's time, this is incredibly important because it can create increased outdoor spaces for businesses and economic activity. Now, through our network, Surat in India and Paris in France both borrowed this idea and have created multifunctional public plazas as spaces for community recreational opportunities and ceremonial activities. So we have temples that are dedicated to Ganesha in times of normality, and then in flooding, they become these flood plazas. Now, we are a network of urban doers, and I want to close by really calling this group and those on the call to action. City-led partnership is critical, and our network is comprised of hundreds of experts who are working on solving these problems, bringing together unparalleled global urban resilience knowledge, practice, and partnerships to find the right solutions at the right times for our most pressing challenges. And so I'm really looking forward to the continued conversation with the other speakers and with this group, because there is a lot that we have to do, but together we can build back better. Thank you, James.
Very good. Okay, thank you to all three of you. Those are three great perspectives with which to begin. So I think what I'd like to do, given that we are at the Festival of Innovation, obviously we want to talk about innovations and examples of innovations. But before we do that, I want to sort of set the ground with a realistic assessment of how things are from each of your perspectives. In a sense, before the pandemic began, all three of you in your own way were trying to push forward with policies for a greener and more sustainable world. And my sense is that a lot of that has become much more difficult, although Lauren's point about the opportunity for future innovation is well taken. So maybe Lauren, can I sort of start with you? What are you hearing from your city's network about how much more difficult their task has become in the aftermath of the pandemic, and maybe tell us a little bit more about what you've heard from the projects that they were thinking about, or their priorities in the aftermath of the pandemic, and then I'll ask the same thing to Emil and Kanni.
Thanks, James. It's a great question. Cities the world over have one primary concern, which is how can we respond quickly enough with less, right? All of our cities, all of our countries are stressed because revenues are shrinking. And so there is a pressure to really look carefully at budgets and be laser focused on how we direct our spending. And I think, Emil gave some very pointed examples of how in East Java, you have been careful to design at different times for different kinds of relief for your citizens. And that's very common. What we're hearing from our cities is we need to prioritize this integration of response and basic services with building infrastructure and social services that are future ready. And if you look at the examples of what we've experienced this summer, we have seen massive flooding and typhoons in some places, and then incredible heat waves, registering temperatures that are skyrocketing in others. And these two kinds of phenomena give us the example of what we're hearing from our city network, which is we need to design these types of infrastructure, stormwater, water and sanitation services. Those are a huge priority, in particular in our emerging cities, so that we can have adequate places to wash our hands. Right? Who knew that one of the biggest questions we'd be asking ourselves in 2020 was, do you have a safe place to wash your hands? This is absolutely critical in our emerging cities. And all over the world, as we prepare, cities are looking at their stormwater systems, their waste management systems to ensure that they are going to be able to have capacity to deal with increasing precipitation. And in our cities worldwide, and we are a proud member of the Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance, along with our partners at the Atlantic Council and the Red Cross are on this, cities are really worried about how you keep citizens safe as temperatures rise, and you cannot have as many people indoors in cooling centers. So how do you adapt the city and develop warning systems and infrastructure that can be responsive to the current challenge and those that we're going to be facing in the future?
Just one other quick follow-up, Lauren. So you said in your presentation you said response, recovery, and then building a new normal. When you're talking to your city members, where are we now? Are we still in response, or are we now in the kind of place where urban leaders are beginning to plan for this new recovery? Or in a sense, have we not quite reached that? Is it still all hands on deck, trying to flatten the curve, as Emil said. And I'll turn to Emil for a response on this in a minute too.
It's a great question, James, and there's no one answer. Cities are actually, in most cases, dealing with those three phases that I mentioned: response, recovery, and planning a new normal in parallel. So if we are talking to members of our city network who are in Wellington or Christchurch, right, they are in a response and a new normal building mode because of the early action that they were able to take quite successfully. Whereas, as Emil was saying, there are still rising cases in Indonesia, in India, in my home country, in the States. There is still a lot of uncertainty about what the next few months looks like. So city leaders don't have the luxury of choosing. In fact, I think all of our government leaders and our city leaders who are on the front lines are forced to do these tasks simultaneously. And that's where the network can become very useful, because those cities who have less of an urgency and response, who have outlined how to approach these resilient recovery issues, are able to share those practices across the network directly with their colleagues. And we have seen that over 80% of our chief resilience officers, who are the ones who are leading resilience action in our city members, over 80% of them are involved in the response and recovery efforts. So they're well placed to share with each other policies that are happening in real time and help each other to deal with those three phases.
Very good. Emil, can I put the same question to you? Again, I'm keen that we hear, in a sense, how challenging is this on the ground? So you outlined in your presentation the steps that you've been taking, but prior to COVID, I imagine that East Java had all sorts of plans for sustainability, energy renewal, combating climate change. How difficult has it been to keep these on track? And in a sense, what is the reality of the situation that you're now facing on that front?
Well, I think, of course, the pandemic has, first of all, shifted our attention. Second, shifted our resources towards battling the spread of the virus. And we have to admit that some of the groundwork for these efforts to promote sustainability and renewable energy may have suffered from a bit of a setback, but I don't think it's a massive setback because, for example, we were working on flood mitigation measures, as well as we also look into addressing quality of river water discharges from factories. We're not actually taking any step back from those agenda right now. We're still committed to ensuring that we have a facility to manage industrial waste in order to minimize the risk of factories actually discharging these industrial waste in an improper manner. So I think we do, when it comes to investments in private investments, there will be an issue because I think a lot of investors are on a wait and see mode. But when it comes to government involvements in mitigating flood, we realize that keeping government spending as well in other sectors would also be important. But we try to, for example, really eliminate some areas that some areas may suffer, certain areas, certain sectors in the government spending. For example, of course, government try to promote some activities. Maybe I have to admit, probably some of the sectors that suffer the most would be in tourism, maybe in culture, creative economy, but things that are really touching the grassroots, such as improving roads and then managing the rivers, we still proceed with that because on a scale of priority, these are in line with mitigating disaster, and that is very important because at times when the economy results in vulnerability, I think disaster impact will be escalated. So we need to take a proactive approach in managing this agenda.
Very good. Okay, no, that's I mean, in a sense, what we're talking about here this morning is the importance of innovation in a situation where the circumstances demand it, and money perhaps is less plentiful than it was before. So this is the perfect environment for innovation. Kanni, can I ask you just the same question, really? I mean, from your point of view, you said at the beginning, quite chastening, many of the hard-won development goals that your organization and others have championed and helped to bring about are in a sense reversing. But what do you see? How challenging are the circumstances on the ground? Just so we understand, and then let's talk about, in a sense, the optimism and innovations that you see after that. So how bad is it out there?
Well, it's the glass half empty or the glass half full, right? So I think let me say that for years we've been saying that the health budget of countries should be in the double digits. That this shouldn't be seen as a cost; it should be seen as an investment. Because if you don't, a country that doesn't invest in its people and put people's health first and their knowledge first, no matter how good your infrastructure is, you're just not going to be moving as fast as everyone else. And so you've seen countries that had kept their health budgets at 1.5, 2, maybe 3%, now looking to double it and really rapidly ratcheting that up. Now, part of that is because of the emergency measures on PPEs, etc. But what I'm hoping, so the glass half full, is that we're seeing that some of these investments are actually there to stay. And what Emil said, you're seeing the shift in budget priorities happening. That's one. The second is this completely inextricable link between people's lives and the environment, the natural environment we live in, right? And the fact that we have not invested in protecting, managing that environment, whether these are in ecologically fragile zones, in biodiverse areas that we have destroyed, our water resources from, as Lauren said, from rivers to forests. This is the damage that we have caused, and the fact that we haven't actually put back everything we've taken is showing the jump, right? I mean, this virus could have been avoided, and a lot of coronaviruses can be avoided if we hadn't destroyed the natural habitats, and climate change is devastating this. So now we're seeing the interest in putting back some of these. Now, what it is going to mean in the short term, including in the move to renewables, and we're seeing this. Indonesia is doing an amazing job in investing more in hydro, in solar, etc. Is in the short term, there is a carrying cost. There's going to be stranded assets. We have gotten used to these fossil fuel-based and fueled economies, which gave us the fast growth, but at a heavy cost. And not just a cost on pollution, and then we say, well, we'll clean that up later. That has been the model of fast growth in almost all parts of Asia. But there's another heavy cost, which is growing inequalities and injustices come with that type of push. And now we're seeing a halt, and the fact that we're looking much more at saying what is going on locally here. How can we help the people, large numbers of people, just falling off the edge? And again, Emil's point that they're looking at how to bridge with a basic income, with credits, to keep people alive. And these are not even people who've got affected immediately by the virus, but these are people who will otherwise starve. And so that change in what actually makes for a prosperous society and economy, I think, is shifting. And my last point maybe here is this issue of money. We keep saying there's not enough money. There's a whole lot of money out there. It's not a matter of fiscal space. I strongly believe that. It's a matter of political fiscal choice. And that is where the right choices on where to invest, not just in this emergency kind of period, but putting in a very different way of developing for a much more sustainable way moving forward that puts both people and their environment ahead of everything else, is also showing a return that I think private investment is also going to follow. But public policy and public investment will flag that, and then you'll see the rest coming behind. Back to you, James.
Very good. Okay. Well put. So I want to use the remaining 10 minutes that we have to give our audience a sense of reasons for optimism, to highlight some examples of innovations that we see around the region or good practices. So Kanni, let's stay with you. I mean, one thing that it occurs for me to ask about is you've looked at the recovery and stimulus efforts in the aftermath of COVID. And so I wondered if you might kind of pick some best practices from there, or if not, just give us a few examples that you've seen of countries or cities or regions that in a sense have taken a particularly enlightened or forward-looking approach to sustainability in the last 6 months when they've been coping with COVID. And then I'll ask Emil and Lauren to fish out some good optimistic examples of their own.
Well, let me pick 3 or 4 very optimistic trends that we're seeing. One is, in our region, the majority of people, so I'm talking 70-80% of people, are not covered by a robust or sustained social protection system. And as we heard from Emil, countries are putting this in now. And I hope that this isn't just a bridging mechanism, that this truly looks at the fact that we could be hit by all kinds of shocks, not just a virus, but by climate shocks. A natural disaster is a good one. And that there'll be a good enough, robust system, whether we call that a social safety net, whether we call that a basic income, SME credits, employment guarantees, that this is something that becomes part and parcel of an economic and social package that we offer. That's one. Second, we are really seeing the fact that we are creating more jobs and healthier jobs for young people in the renewable sector. So there is a double win there, which is that it's less polluting going forward, particularly in our big cities, and Lauren's network would be very, very aware of this, that the new jobs for young people need to come in areas that are not the old industry, not the old practices. So even in the digital economy, we're seeing a new set of skills emerging that allows people to move forward, and that investment happening in our region increasingly. And maybe the last point is, I would say, if one had just $1 extra, the question is, where would you put it? Or 1 rupee, right? If you had 1 extra rupee, where would you put it? And I would say in a kid's education. That to me is where we're seeing also, there was a growing trend and then it's plateaued. And now we're seeing countries that have managed to hold that education trend and move people's education, but particularly children's education. And remember, children's education is so closely related to children's and women's nutrition. These investments really moving forward. So I think, James, there's no going back from this. And I too am an optimist. I'm not a millennial, but I'm an optimist. And I think we're on a track that we just cannot head back. Politically, we cannot head back. And we've got good examples and good leaders out there showing how it's getting done.
Right. I'm not a millennial either, so we representatives of the former and declining generation will look to the younger generation to give us some fresh ideas. So Emil, you told us a little bit about some of the projects that you were sticking to even in these difficult times, but perhaps give us a sense of things you're seeing on the ground, innovations either in East Java or elsewhere that you've seen that you think offer possibilities for how you can continue to move forward on sustainability and climate issues, even in a difficult pandemic situation?
Yeah, I think we need to be very specific in our local context on what are the key climate change risks that took place. I think first of all is usually the fossil fuel consumption that needs to be reduced. Now, we are in line with the central government's priority to actually promote biodiesel. Although, of course, there's also another side to it, because biodiesel, some people also see other side, but it's still not fossil fuel. So it's one step better. But of course, we are also looking forward towards electric vehicles, for example. But I think the pandemic is starting to allow us to question what are the essential mobility that we need actually, and that kind of help reduce our ecological footprint. So there is a forced ecological footprint reduction that took place because of the pandemic, and at the same time we try to maintain productivity by virtue of digital platforms, and we're seeing that this COVID-19 allows us, especially on the political space, it is usually a luxury to be talking about digitization. People always say that digital is the agenda of the haves, of the rich, and when you talk about the poor, let's not talk about digital first, let's talk about the basic necessities. But now those two are part of the two sides of the same coin. I mean, I think we cannot actually address issues of feeding the poor if we don't address digitization. I think the kids in the rural areas, in the most isolated parts of the area, cannot go to school, and we need to talk about how they can access internet, how they have the gadget that they need. So innovations are abundant right now because there's a lot of problems that need to be solved. I cannot list all of them one by one, but we're seeing that public institutions began streamlining and reducing bureaucratic measures in processing licenses and servicing the communities because of the pandemic. So there is a situation that forces us to accelerate the making it less bureaucratic, if you call it debureaucratization. So that's the key. And again, I like to say, because there are more problems to solve, there will be more solutions to accelerate. And I think the political environment that that determines what kind of public policy making we do are actually now hungry for digital solutions, for innovations. And we are still proceeding with our plan to do a launchpad for a cloud computing based public sector solutions in one of the special economic zone in East Java. So we would like to have all 38 municipalities, more than 8,000 local rural governments to also start learning and embarking more on cloud computing solutions, so that they can try to test out more digital innovations. One last thing, I hope I don't want you. In the marketplace, where there's a lot of interaction when people shop, we install CCTV using artificial intelligence to detect whether people are observing the use of mask or not. And that's one of the way that we try to achieve more with less, because people cannot go out too much. So we need to rely on technology to do that.
Very good. Okay, thanks. So I promised everyone we'd finish at 10 o'clock local time. So Lauren, last word to you. Do you, in the last minute or minute and a half we have, did you want to give us a few examples? You mentioned Ecuador and Rotterdam. Do you have any from this region or elsewhere that you'd like to highlight from your city's network?
James, I have plenty of examples, but respecting time and also building on the very specific examples that Kanni and Emil gave, I would say this: there is tremendous opportunity to build more sustainable solutions, right, that focus on renewables, education, technology. But the actual objective of the game is not to do these in silos. Right? We have the resources, and so designing the kinds of projects that deliver multiple benefits to citizens is really essential. And there are phenomenal examples the world over. In fact, I think it can become overwhelming when we try to list them out individually. So I think what is incredibly exciting about the next steps that we're taking with our network is to actually categorize these types of successful examples that respond to these challenges and maximize value. We find that cities who are designing these resilience projects for multiple benefits are getting at least 3x value on the dollar for their investments. So I would say you have to design for multiple benefits and use networks and sharing so that you're not reinventing the wheel. Different governments have very similar challenges in similar types of cities and contexts. And so we've started a community online. It's called Cities for Resilient Recovery. It has communities of practice that share specific examples within different kinds of challenge areas to solve problems. And so I would say that we have a real opportunity to speed the response and share solutions through these networks so that we can really help citizens to recover and get to a more equitable and safer situation in our future cities.
Very good. Thank you for that. That's an excellent point on which to close. And I want to thank all three of my speakers, Kanni from the UNDP, Emil joining us from East Java, and Lauren here representing the home team in Singapore. This is not the end of our discussion about innovation, however, as part of GovInsider's Festival of Innovation. The next session, which is coming on immediately after this, is going to be chaired by Amit Roy Chowdhury, who's a columnist for GovInsider and is going to look again at resilience and innovation. So I will hand over to him, and all that it remains for me to do is to give one more vote of thanks to my speakers and to say thank you very much for joining us here today. Many thanks to you all, and see you again soon.
Thank you, James.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you.